Marriage has always been portrayed as the cornerstone of civilization, the sacred union that binds man and woman together for stability, for family, for love. But when we strip away the romantic illusions, when we remove the glittering veil that society throws over this institution, we see something much darker beneath. Few thinkers dared to reveal this truth with such brutality and clarity as Arthur Schopenhauer. Unlike the fairy tales of eternal love or the modern propaganda of equality and partnership, Schopenhauer saw marriage for what it really is, not a celebration of love, but a battlefield where man inevitably loses. He argued that the very foundation of marriage is not based on happiness, romance, or even companionship, but on something far more primal: the blind, unconscious will to reproduce. For Schopenhauer, love and attraction are simply nature's trick, luring men into a contract that ultimately sacrifices their freedom, wealth, vitality, and even their peace of mind. The institution of marriage, in his words, is nothing less than a trap, one that men walk into willingly, believing they are gaining love, only to discover later that they have lost almost everything in exchange. And here is where the cruelty of nature reveals itself. Man enters marriage thinking he is the chooser, the one pursuing, desiring, and conquering. But in reality, he is the one being chosen, manipulated, and consumed by forces larger than himself. In the end, he becomes the provider, the protector, the laborer, and often the broken soul who discovers too late that his sacrifice was never truly for his own benefit. In this video, we will dissect Schopenhauer's dark but honest analysis of marriage. We will explore why he believed men always lose, why women hold the hidden advantage, and why the institution itself is tilted in favor of the female psyche and the perpetuation of life. This is not a romantic story. It is the harsh truth most men never realize until it's too late. Let's begin. Part 1. The Illusion of Love, Nature's Trap. To understand why Schopenhauer believed men always lose in marriage, we must first understand his philosophy of love itself. Unlike the poets or the idealists, who celebrated love as the highest of human emotions, Schopenhauer cut straight to the bone. Love, he said, is nothing more than nature's trick to ensure reproduction. The grand passion, the fire that consumes men, the obsession with a woman's beauty or charm, none of this exists for the man's happiness. Instead, it exists only so the human race can continue. Think about this carefully. When a man falls in love, he believes he has found someone special, someone unique. He feels that his choice is free, his desire spontaneous, and his devotion personal. But Schopenhauer argued that this is an illusion. In reality, the man is being pulled by unconscious forces, by instincts designed not to serve his fulfillment, but to serve the species. He thinks he has chosen her, but in truth, nature has chosen her through him. Nowhere does this deception become more visible than in marriage. When a man marries, he believes he is securing love, stability, and partnership. But what is he really securing? He is entering into a lifelong contract where his labor, his resources, his very energy are redirected away from himself and toward the woman and the children she may bear. The joy of love that once consumed him burns out quickly, and what remains is duty, a duty that is not to himself but to others. And here lies the bitter irony. The stronger a man's love was before marriage, the greater his suffering often becomes afterward. The passion that once blinded him to reality fades, and he is left with the heavy chains of obligation. What nature wanted has already been achieved. The bond was created, the reproduction potential secured. Now the illusion dissipates, and the man realizes that what he thought was for him was never his at all. Schopenhauer compared this to a baited trap. Love is the bait, marriage is the cage. The man walks in willingly, enchanted by promises of beauty, companionship, and intimacy, but once inside, he finds himself shackled by responsibilities he cannot escape. The woman, on the other hand, has achieved what her instincts desired: security, provision, and a man tied permanently to her. This is why Schopenhauer claimed that love stories rarely end well for men. They may start with passion and fire, but they end with disillusionment, resentment, and loss. The man has sacrificed his freedom and vitality for an institution that was never designed for his benefit. He has been deceived, not by the woman herself, but by nature, the greatest trickster of all. And so the first step in Schopenhauer's brutal truth about marriage is this: love is not the promise of happiness, but the bait of nature. And once a man takes that bait, he is already on the path toward losing everything he thought he was gaining. Part 2. The economics of marriage, a deal men cannot win. Marriage, according to Schopenhauer, is not only a biological trap but also an economic one. Behind the veil of romance, marriage is a transaction, a deal between man and woman. But unlike most deals, this one is deeply unbalanced, designed so that the man gives more than he receives, and the woman gains more than she risks. Let us break this down. In most marriages, what does the man bring? He brings his labor, his income, his physical protection, his social status, his name, and often his inheritance. He assumes the burden of provider, the one who ensures survival and stability. He works, he toils, he sacrifices his time, his ambitions, and sometimes even his health to sustain the household. And what does the woman bring? Primarily her youth, her beauty, her fertility. But unlike the man's contributions, which must continue for a lifetime, hers are temporary. Beauty fades, fertility ends, and yet the contract of marriage demands that the man continue to provide long after the very things that attracted him are gone. In other words, the man invests his lifelong labor into something that is, by nature, short-lived. This is why Schopenhauer saw marriage as inherently unfair. It demands of men a perpetual cost for a fleeting benefit. The woman, through marriage, secures what her instincts desire most, long-term provision and protection. But the man, through marriage, loses what his instincts desire most: freedom, variety, and self-determination. He is bound to one household, one role, one duty, and he cannot escape without ruin. The imbalance deepens when we consider the legal and social structures that have historically supported marriage. Even in Schopenhauer's time, the law was designed to hold men accountable as providers, while giving women the position of dependence and entitlement. In modern times, this imbalance has only grown, with men often facing devastating losses in divorce courts, custody battles, and financial obligations that extend long after the marriage has ended. Schopenhauer did not believe this was accidental. To him, marriage was nature's way of ensuring that women, who bear the greater physical burden of reproduction, are compensated by men's labor and sacrifice. But from the man's perspective, this is a losing game. He exchanges his independence for responsibility, his energy for obligation, and his wealth for the fleeting joy of passion that soon evaporates. And perhaps the most tragic part of all is that most men walk into this arrangement blindly. They believe they are gaining something noble, sacred, eternal. But in truth, they are entering into a deal they cannot win, a contract written by nature herself, where the fine print ensures that the man always pays more than he gains. This, Schopenhauer argued, is why men always lose in marriage. They are not entering a partnership of equals, but a transaction of unequals, one where they give their life's labor for a promise that was never meant to last. Part 3. The loss of freedom. Man becomes a servant. If there is one thing Schopenhauer valued above all else, it was freedom. To him, freedom was not simply political liberty or social independence. It was the ability for a man to live his life according to his own will, unchained from the demands of others. But marriage, in Schopenhauer's eyes, annihilates this freedom. It does not just limit it. It transforms man from master of his own destiny into a servant of another's needs. When a man is unmarried, he retains the capacity to decide where he lives, how he spends his money, and what ambitions he pursues. His time belongs to him, his labor belongs to him, and his energy can be directed toward his own projects, desires, and aspirations. But once he enters marriage, all of this changes. His time becomes tied to the rhythms of domestic life. His labor becomes the fuel for sustaining a household, and his money is no longer his own, but a shared or often demanded resource. The man who once was free now becomes responsible not only for himself but for his wife, her well-being, her security, and eventually her children. Every decision he makes is no longer about what he desires, but about what sustains the family. Schopenhauer saw this shift as a profound degradation of the male spirit. Instead of being a man pursuing greatness, the married man becomes a man ensuring survival. His life is no longer a personal journey, but a function of service to others. And here lies the deeper cruelty. Women instinctively know this. They may not articulate it, but they sense that marriage gives them power over a man's freedom. Once he is bound, once he has entered the contract, she becomes the center of his responsibility. Her needs take priority, her desires shape his actions, and her expectations define his worth. Even if she is not consciously manipulative, the very structure of marriage makes her the master and him the servant. Schopenhauer compared this to slavery. While it may not look like chains and whips, it is a slavery of obligation, a subtle form of bondage where the man must continually provide, protect, and labor, not because he freely chooses to, but because the marriage contract compels him. Even if he wishes to walk away, society, law, and morality hold him accountable. Divorce may seem like an escape, but as countless men have discovered, it is an escape that costs them half their wealth, access to their children, and often their dignity. Part 4. The female advantage: why women benefit more. Schopenhauer did not deny that marriage involved sacrifice for both sexes. Women, after all, bear the physical burden of pregnancy, childbirth, and nurturing children. But he argued that within the structure of marriage, women secure far more than men. The institution itself is tilted to favor female advantage, ensuring that even though they sacrifice their youth and beauty, they gain lifelong security, protection, and provision. To understand this, we must recognize the fundamental asymmetry between male and female roles in reproduction. A man's biological investment in creating life is minimal, a single act. A woman's investment, however, is immense. 9 months of pregnancy, the pain of childbirth, and years of nurturing. Nature, therefore, designed women to seek stability and resources to compensate for this enormous investment. Marriage, Schopenhauer argued, is precisely the institution that fulfills this. Once a woman marries, she secures a man's resources not temporarily, but permanently. His income, his labor, his home, his very life trajectory are now aligned with her security. Even if her beauty fades, even if her fertility ends, the contract of marriage ensures that the man must continue providing. In effect, she trades a temporary asset, her youth and attractiveness, for a lifelong stream of benefits. This is not manipulation on her part. It is nature's silent bargain. Men, on the other hand, do not receive equivalent benefits. What a man desires most, freedom, variety, admiration, and the pursuit of greatness, is restricted by marriage. His rewards are temporary: the initial passion of love, the promise of intimacy, the joy of children. But as years pass, these rewards diminish, while his obligations remain or even increase. The scales are not balanced. The man gives more over time, while the woman receives more over time. And here lies the unspoken truth Schopenhauer revealed. Women instinctively understand their advantage. They may not think of it in philosophical terms, but they know that marriage ties a man to them in ways that benefit them more than him. This is why women are more eager to marry than men. It is why society pressures men into marriage rather than women. It is why, throughout history, the failure to marry has been seen as a defect in a man, but not in a woman. Part 5. The end of romance, when passion dies. One of Schopenhauer's most brutal observations about marriage is that Romance, the very thing that lures men into it, is also the first thing to die within it. He argued that love, far from being eternal, is by nature fleeting. It is a flame designed to burn brightly only long enough to bind two people together for the sake of reproduction. Once that purpose is achieved, the flame begins to extinguish. For men, this is perhaps the most painful realization. They enter marriage under the spell of passion, convinced that their desire for their wife will remain strong, that the intimacy they share will endure, and that the bond of love will only deepen with time. But reality is harsher. The familiarity of daily life, the demands of responsibility, the fading of beauty, and the sheer passage of time erode the passion that once seemed indestructible. And here lies the trap. When passion dies for the man, duty remains. He must continue to provide, to labor, to sacrifice, even though the very force that led him into marriage has vanished. The woman, on the other hand, often finds that her leverage increases as romance fades. She no longer needs to maintain the same level of intimacy to secure his loyalty. The contract itself binds him. She may withdraw affection, reduce passion, or shift her focus entirely to children, but the man remains obligated to her and the family. This creates a cruel irony. The very reason men marry, love, intimacy, companionship, is the very thing most likely to fade first. And once it fades, the man discovers that he has traded his freedom and resources for a passion that no longer exists. What he thought would bring him happiness has become a burden he must carry without joy. Schopenhauer described this as one of nature's most merciless tricks. The man believes he is acting for love, but in reality he is acting for reproduction. Once reproduction is secured, nature no longer fuels the fire of passion, and the man is left with a hollow shell of what once was. He may try to reignite the romance, to chase again the intimacy he once had, but often it is gone beyond recovery. Part 6. The burden of children. Man's legacy or his chain. For many men, the greatest justification for marriage is children. Society has long told men that fatherhood is the highest fulfillment of masculinity, that to raise children is to secure one's legacy and ensure immortality through bloodline. But Schopenhauer, always unafraid to strip away illusions, warned that even children, the supposed blessing of marriage, can become the heaviest of chains for a man. At first glance, children appear to be the reward, the living proof of love. They carry a man's name, his features, and his future. But beneath this noble vision lies a brutal reality. Children are not simply the man's legacy. They are his responsibility, and that responsibility, once assumed, can never be escaped. A man can divorce a wife, but he cannot divorce a child. Schopenhauer observed that the cost of raising children almost always falls disproportionately on the father. It is his labor, his earnings, his time, and his sacrifices that sustain them. He works longer hours, takes fewer risks, and often gives up personal dreams in order to provide. His life narrows into one purpose, sustaining dependents who constantly demand more. And while society praises him for this sacrifice, it rarely rewards him. Fathers are often invisible compared to mothers, who are celebrated as the true nurturers and anchors of family life. If the marriage fails, the children are often taken by the mother, leaving the father reduced to a visitor in their lives, while still being required to support them financially. The one thing he believed was his legacy becomes instead a reminder of his loss. But even in intact marriages, Schopenhauer warned that children often pull the man further into servitude. His desires no longer matter. His ambitions are secondary. Every decision is filtered through the needs of the children. Where to live, how to spend, what risks to avoid. His life becomes a series of sacrifices disguised as responsibilities. He works not for himself, but for those who depend on him, often without gratitude, and sometimes even without respect. Part 7. The final realization. Why men always lose. By now the pattern should be clear. Marriage begins with love, but love is an illusion. It promises freedom of choice, but delivers bondage. It seems like a partnership, but it is an unequal transaction. It offers passion, but passion dies. It offers children, but they become chains. And through it all, the man is the one who loses the most: his freedom, his wealth, his time, his ambitions, and often his very sense of self. Schopenhauer believed that this was not merely an accident of culture or law, but an inescapable truth written into the very nature of existence. Men are the expendable sex. They are designed to labor, to provide, and to sacrifice so that life itself may continue. Marriage is simply the institutional form of this sacrifice, the cage that ensures men will fulfill their role without escape. And yet, the tragedy is that most men do not realize this until it is too late. They walk willingly into marriage, intoxicated by love, blinded by passion, and pressured by society. They believe they are entering into the noblest of bonds, but in reality, they are entering into a slow and inevitable defeat. By the time they awaken to the truth, their freedom is gone, their resources depleted, and their youth spent. Schopenhauer was ruthless in his conclusion. Men always lose in marriage because marriage was never designed for their benefit. It was designed for nature's benefit, for the survival of the species, and for the security of women. Men are the currency that marriage spends, not the ones who profit from it. And yet, and this is perhaps the most haunting part, men continue to marry. Despite the warnings, despite the failures, despite the countless examples of suffering, men still line up to bind themselves to this institution. Why? Because the illusion of love is too powerful, because the instinct to reproduce is too deeply rooted, and because society has woven marriage into the very fabric of respectability and identity. To reject it is to stand against the tide of human history itself. The choice men must face. So what do we make of Schopenhauer's brutal analysis? Should men abandon marriage altogether? Should they retreat into solitude, avoiding the trap at all costs? Or should they accept marriage as an unavoidable destiny, a burden every generation must carry for the survival of the species? Schopenhauer himself leaned toward the first answer. He believed that the wise man would see through the illusions of love and marriage, choosing instead a life of solitude, contemplation, and freedom. He saw marriage as a prison for the male spirit, a sacrifice too great for the fleeting joys it promised. To him, the man who avoided marriage was not a coward, but a philosopher, one who dared to live for himself rather than for the will of nature. But in the end, the decision lies with each man. Some will choose freedom and they may suffer loneliness. Others will choose marriage and they will suffer bondage. There is no path without suffering, only different kinds of suffering. The question is which suffering you are willing to endure, the suffering of solitude or the suffering of sacrifice. What Schopenhauer gives us, however, is not an answer but a warning. He strips away the illusion so that men may walk into their choices with open eyes. He reminds us that the promises of romance are fleeting, that the contract of marriage is unbalanced, and that nature itself is not on our side. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson. To live as a man is to recognize the traps set before you, to see through the illusions that society and nature create, and to choose your path not blindly, but with full awareness of the cost. Because in the end, Schopenhauer's truth still echoes. In marriage, men always lose. The only question is whether you will step into that trap knowingly, or refuse it entirely, and carve out a different fate.